The human was immune, so he saved the alien girl from JPG. The sun was a cold, distant orb in the sky as the planet Futura's twin moons rose. A strange, eerie calm fell over the city, one that only a few humans had noticed. The outbreak of a mysterious virus was spreading quickly through the alien population. The alien doctors were doing everything they could, but it was clear. This plague had no mercy. Among the humans working in the colony, one man, Dr. Adam Kane, stood out. Kane had been brought to the planet to assist with agricultural research. However, when the virus hit, his expertise was needed for something entirely different. The alien race, the Ithari, had been exposed to countless diseases before, but this one was unlike anything they had ever faced. The Ithari were strong, resilient, and had built a powerful civilization, but the virus was threatening to destroy them. It moved too fast and their immune systems couldn't fight it. The Ithari called it the Black Breath, and the name alone terrified them. It attacked their lungs, choked them, and left them unable to breathe. Those who survived the first wave were often left in a weakened state, unable to function at full capacity. The Ithari were not used to asking for help. They had always been the dominant force on their world, but this virus humbled them. In their desperation, they turned to the humans for assistance, believing the virus might not affect them in the same way. Human beings were often immune to diseases that devastated other species, so it made sense to try. Kane sat in a small lab that had been converted into an emergency medical station. His head ached from the stress, and his fingers trembled as he typed into the console. The Ithari leaders had provided him with data, but much of it was incomplete. Their understanding of biology was vast, but their knowledge of the virus was still limited. The lab smelled of antiseptic, but Kane had grown used to it. What unsettled him was the silence, the quiet panic in the air. People were dying, and no one knew how to stop it. He rubbed his eyes and leaned back in his chair. His mind kept returning to one thought: why wasn't he getting sick? His exposure to the virus had been identical to that of the Ithari, yet he had shown no symptoms. No fever, no cough, no shortness of breath. He was fine. It was a mystery, one that gnawed at him. He ran countless tests, but every result came back inconclusive. It didn't make sense. The door to the lab opened, and Kane stood up quickly. "Dr. Kane, we need you immediately," a voice said. It was Lyra, a young Ithari woman who worked as an aide to the medical staff. She was tall and graceful, with long silver hair and sharp green eyes. Despite the chaos around them, she had maintained her composure. But now there was a note of urgency in her voice. "What's going on?" Kane asked, grabbing his medical kit. "It's my mother. She's not responding to the treatment," Lyra said, her voice tight. "You have to help her." Kane's heart skipped a beat. Lyra's mother was one of the highest-ranking medical officers on the planet. She had been working tirelessly to find a cure for the virus, and now she was dying. "Lead the way," Kane said, gathering his things and following her out of the lab. Lyra led him through the narrow corridors of the medical complex, past groups of alien doctors and workers who moved with a sense of grim determination. No one had time for formalities anymore. People were either fighting the virus or succumbing to it. There was no middle ground. They arrived at the quarantine wing, where the worst of the infected were being kept. Kane's eyes scanned the room and his chest tightened. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic, sweat, and fear. The Ithari were a proud species, but seeing them like this, weak and vulnerable, was unsettling. Lyra stopped in front of a small room, her hand resting on the doorframe. "She's inside." Kane nodded, stepping forward and entering. Lyra's mother, High Healer Talais, lay unconscious on a sterile bed. Her breathing was shallow, and her once strong form looked frail. The virus had ravaged her, and the medical equipment surrounding her was all but useless now. It was clear that she was beyond help. Kane stood at the foot of the bed, his heart heavy. He had seen many deaths in his career, but something about this one felt different. The Ithari were a noble people, and Talais was one of their greatest minds. To see her reduced to this was hard to accept. "I'll do everything I can," Kane said quietly, though he wasn't sure how much that would be. He had no cure, no plan. He could only hope that his immunity to the virus might be the key. Lyra moved to her mother's side, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "You have to save her, Dr. Kane. You're the only one who can." Kane nodded, setting to work. He checked the monitors, adjusted the medications, and tried to stabilize her vitals. but despite his best efforts, it became clear that there was little he could do. The virus had already taken hold too strongly. Taylai's condition worsened, and soon her breathing became erratic. Lyra watched, helpless, as her mother's life slipped away. "Please," she whispered, "please save her." Kane's heart ached for her. He had no idea how to save her mother. He could feel the weight of her gaze on him, the desperate hope that he could do what no one else could. But he didn't have the answers. He couldn't stop the virus. And then, as he looked down at Taylai's, something changed. There was a sudden, sharp pain in his chest, and he staggered back, clutching his side. He gasped for air, his lungs tightening. Lyra's eyes widened in panic. "Dr. Kane, what's happening?" Kane shook his head, trying to clear the fog in his mind. I'm fine," but his voice was strained. His heartbeat was erratic, and his head swam with dizziness. Lyra stepped forward, placing a cool hand on his shoulder. "You're sick. You need to lie down." "No," Kane said, pushing her hand away. "I can't. I'm fine." But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. His body was reacting to the virus in ways he had never anticipated. The virus wasn't affecting him the same way it affected the HFY, but it was still there, lurking inside him. And suddenly it hit him. He was immune to the virus. The virus was trying to infect him, but his body was fighting it off. The realization came too late, though. The virus had begun to adapt, and it was starting to affect him in ways he couldn't control. Lyra watched him, a mixture of fear and confusion on her face. "What's happening to you?" she asked, her voice trembling. Kane stumbled backward, his vision blurry. "I don't know. I think I'm immune." Lyra's eyes widened as the truth settled in. "You're not sick. You're not infected." "No," Kane replied, his voice growing faint. I think I'm the cure." Lyra looked at him in disbelief. "The cure?" she whispered. "How?" Before Kane could answer, his body collapsed. He fell to the floor, his world spinning out of control. Lyra screamed for help, but it was too late. Kane had passed out, leaving the fate of both himself and the Ithara hanging in the balance. Kane woke up to the sound of beeping. His head was throbbing, and for a moment he couldn't remember where he was. The cool, sterile scent of the medical room filled his nose, and he slowly opened his eyes. Lyra was sitting by his side, her hand gripping the edge of his bed. She looked exhausted, her eyes swollen from crying. He tried to sit up, but his body felt heavy, as though it had been drained of all its strength. "What happened?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Lyra jumped to her feet, her eyes wide with concern. "Doctor." "Kane, you're awake?" Her voice cracked as she spoke, and Kane could see the mix of relief and fear in her expression. "You passed out. You said you were immune." Kane's mind raced as he tried to piece together what had happened. The virus had attacked him in some way, but he hadn't been fully aware of it. But now, the reality of it was clear. He had been immune to the virus, but the virus had been adapting to him. He looked at Lyra. "I'm fine now," he said, forcing himself to sit up. "But I think I might be the key to stopping it." Lyra frowned. "What do you mean? How could you be the key?" Kane took a deep breath and wiped the sweat from his forehead. "I don't know yet, but I've been exposed to the virus, and my body is fighting it off. The virus tried to infect me, but my immune system is doing something it's not supposed to. I'm not sure how or why, but it might be the answer we need." Lyra's eyes filled with hope. "You're saying you can save my people?" "I don't know if I can save everyone," Kane replied, "but I can try. The virus is changing, and I need to understand why. I need to test something." Lyra nodded, though she still looked unsure. "How can I help?" Kane stood up slowly, still feeling weak but determined. "I need more data, more samples. I need to figure out exactly how my body is reacting to the virus. I need to isolate the part of my immune system that is protecting me." Lyra hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I'll gather the samples and help with the research. Whatever it takes, I'll do it." Kane walked over to a nearby table and began to gather the medical tools he would need. His mind was focused on one thing: finding the answer. He had to figure out how his immune system was fighting the virus and whether it could be replicated. The Ithari were depending on him. As Lyra helped him prepare, Kane couldn't help but think about the people who had already died. His mind kept returning to Taylai's, Lyra's mother. Her death had hit him harder than he expected. She had been one of the best doctors he had ever worked with, and now she was gone. Kane promised himself that he wouldn't let it be in vain. He would find a way to stop this plague. The two of them worked in silence for a while, Kane preparing the samples and Lyra assisting wherever she could. Her presence was comforting, but Kane knew there was still a long road ahead. He had a lot of questions, and so far he had no answers. Hours passed, and the lab grew quiet except for the soft hum of the medical equipment. Lyra had brought over several more samples from the infected, each one more concerning than the last. Kane felt a weight on his chest, knowing that the longer they waited, the more lives would be lost. He focused on the samples, analyzing the virus under a microscope. The virus was adapting faster than he had anticipated. It was evolving, changing its structure to bypass the immune responses. It wasn't just spreading through the HFY, it was evolving with them. Every new mutation made the virus harder to combat. Kane sighed and rubbed his eyes. "It's smarter than I thought." Lyra, who had been standing nearby, asked, "What do you mean?" "The virus isn't just spreading. It's adapting to every treatment, every defensive move the HFY make," Kane explained. "And now it's trying to adapt to me. But for some reason, it's not succeeding in the same way." Lyra's brow furrowed. "So the virus is changing its behavior. What does that mean for us?" Kane thought for a moment, then replied, "It means the virus is trying to learn. If it can't overcome me in the same way, it might find another way to attack the HFY. We need to act quickly." Lyra looked down, clearly worried. "What can we do?" Kane paused. "I need to isolate the part of my immune system that's resisting the virus. I'll need to run more tests, but there's something else I need." "What?" Lyra asked. "I need your help to gather a larger sample from the HFY who are still alive. We need to test their immune systems against the virus and compare them to mine." Lyra nodded without hesitation. "I'll do whatever it takes." Kane set to work once again, but the hours that followed were long and tiring. He ran test after test, each one showing new results, but none of them were clear answers. The virus was unpredictable, and every new piece of information seemed to raise even more questions. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the lab's small window, Kane was exhausted. But he couldn't stop. Not yet. There was still so much left to understand. He had come so far, but he hadn't found the key yet. Lyra had been helping all night as well, though she was quieter now, perhaps too tired to speak. She stood beside him as he examined yet another sample, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. "How much longer?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible. Kane looked at her and smiled weakly. "I'm not sure, but I'm close. I know I'm close." Lyra watched him carefully, and for the first time, Kane saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him going. He had to keep pushing. He had to find the answer. In that moment, something clicked. He could feel it. His body was reacting to the virus differently than any other species. It wasn't just about immunity, it was something else. Something deeper, more complex. His immune system had found a way to fight the virus that the HFY couldn't. He looked at Lyra, his mind racing. "I know what we need to do. We're going to test something new." Lyra straightened up, her tiredness momentarily forgotten. "What do you need?" "We need to boost my immune system," Kane said. "We need to strengthen it, make it more powerful. If we can isolate what's working and enhance it, we can create a treatment for the HFY. But we're running out of time." Lyra nodded, her determination clear. "I'll do whatever it takes. Just tell me what to do." Kane began to prepare the next series of tests. He couldn't afford to waste any more time. The virus was evolving, and the longer it had to adapt, the harder it would be to stop. They needed a cure, and they needed it now. As he worked, Lyra quietly helped, her presence a constant source of support. The bond between them had grown stronger over the past few days, and Kane couldn't help but appreciate her strength. She had lost so much already, and yet she kept fighting, kept hoping. It was something that gave him the strength to keep going. But even with Lyra's help, the process was slow. Every test felt like a step in the right direction, but Kane knew they were walking a fine line. They couldn't afford any mistakes. Finally, after hours of work, Kane looked at Lyra. "I think we're ready. Let's test this." Lyra nodded, though her face was pale with exhaustion. "I'm with you, Dr. Kane. Let's save my people." Kane took a deep breath. "Let's hope we're not too late." And with that, they began the final series of tests, not knowing if the results would save the HFY or doom them all. But Kane was certain of one thing: he couldn't stop now. Not when there was a chance to save them. Kane sat at the workbench, his eyes glued to the microscope. He had been staring at the same sample for hours, but each time he looked, he saw something different. The virus was changing. It was adapting in ways that didn't make sense. No matter what test he ran, the virus seemed to grow stronger, faster. It was almost as if it could anticipate his every move. Lyra stood nearby, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She had been silent for a while, watching Kane work without saying anything. He could see the weariness in her eyes, the exhaustion that had settled deep in her bones. It had been days since they started this research, and neither of them had slept properly. But there was no time for rest. The virus was winning, and they had to stop it before it was too late. "What's going on, Dr. Kane?" Lyra asked softly, breaking the silence. Kane sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't know, Lyra. The virus is mutating faster than I can keep up with. It's evolving in ways I've never seen before. Every time I think I've found the answer, it changes again." Lyra's eyes darkened. "So, you're saying there's nothing we can do?" "No, I'm not saying that," Kane replied quickly. "I'm just saying it's harder than I thought. But we're not out of options yet." He turned back to the microscope, trying to focus. His mind raced with possibilities, but nothing seemed to work. The virus was no longer just a simple pathogen. It was almost like it had a mind of its own. The way it adapted and learned, it was as if it was trying to outsmart them. Lyra stepped closer, looking over his shoulder. "Is there any way to isolate it, to find its weakness?" Kane paused, his fingers still on the controls. The thought had crossed his mind, but it was a long shot. "I'm trying, but it's like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands. Every time we think we're close, it slips away." He sat back in his chair, his frustration mounting. He was used to solving problems, used to finding solutions, but this virus was unlike anything he had ever encountered. He had been exposed to it multiple times and had survived, but that didn't mean he understood it. It was one thing to be immune, it was another to figure out why. "I think we're missing something," Kane muttered, mostly to himself. "There has to be something we're overlooking." Lyra's voice was filled with concern. "What do you mean?" Kane didn't answer immediately. His thoughts were racing, his mind going over everything they had learned so far. The virus was evolving, yes, but why? What made him different? Why had his immune system been able to resist it? There was a key here, he just had to figure out what it was. I think the virus is targeting something in the immune system. My immune system. Maybe it's using my own resistance as a model. If I can isolate the part of my body that's resisting the virus, we might have a chance to replicate it." Lyra's eyes widened. "You think the answer is in your blood?" Kane nodded. "It might be. I've survived this long and I'm immune, but I don't know why. If we can isolate what makes my immune system different, we might be able to use it to fight the virus." "But how do we do that?" Lyra asked. "I need to draw more blood. I need to run more tests. We need to study my immune cells, how they're reacting to the virus. We need to figure out exactly what's protecting me." Lyra nodded, though the concern on her face was evident. "I'll get the equipment." As she left to gather what they needed, Kane sat back in his chair, trying to collect his thoughts. The virus was smarter than he had anticipated. It wasn't just a disease, it was a challenge. But that was something he understood. He had faced challenges before. It was just a matter of figuring out the right approach. Lyra returned a few minutes later with a tray of medical supplies. She set them down beside Kane and stood back, waiting for him to give the next instructions. Kane took a deep breath and rolled up his sleeve. He had been through many procedures before, but this felt different. This wasn't just a test, it was their last hope. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty that lingered in his chest. Lyra nodded and carefully drew the blood. She worked quickly, her hands steady as she prepared the sample for analysis. Kane watched her, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for her. She had been there with him every step of the way, never hesitating, never wavering. Once the sample was prepared, Kane placed it under the microscope, his fingers trembling slightly as he adjusted the settings. The virus was still there, moving, shifting, changing. He needed to understand how it was adapting to his immune system. He needed to find its weak spot. As he worked, Lyra stood behind him, watching in silence. There was nothing more she could do right now. The weight of their situation hung heavily in the air, and she knew that this moment might decide everything. Kane leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he observed the virus on the screen. It was different now. It was moving slower, almost like it was waiting, and then he saw it. "Wait," Kane whispered, his heart skipping a beat. "It's reacting to my immune cells." Lyra stepped closer, her curiosity piqued. "What does that mean?" Kane's mind raced as he examined the data. "It's not just infecting me, it's learning. It's using my immune system as a template. The virus is trying to replicate my immune cells to create a stronger version of itself." Lyra's eyes widened in shock. "So it's evolving with you?" "Exactly." Kane said, feeling a sense of urgency. It's not just trying to infect me, it's trying to use me to evolve. If we don't stop it now, it will learn how to bypass every defense. Lyra took a step back, her face pale. So, what do we do? Kane's mind was already racing ahead. They couldn't waste any more time. We need to isolate the part of my immune system that's reacting to the virus. If we can do that, we can create a treatment that will work for everyone. Lyra nodded quickly. I'll prepare the lab. Kane didn't wait for her. He had a feeling that they were on the brink of something, and he couldn't let it slip away. The virus was evolving, and so was their chance to fight it. They had to act fast. Hours passed in a blur of tests and data analysis. Lyra was there beside him the entire time, her focus unwavering as they worked together to isolate the specific immune cells that were reacting to the virus. They tested, analyzed, and recalculated, each step bringing them closer to understanding the key to defeating the virus. Finally, as the last test ran, Kane leaned back in his chair, exhausted but relieved. He could see the answer now clearer than ever. "We've got it," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. Lyra looked at him, her eyes wide with hope. "What do we do now?" "We make a cure," Kane replied, his determination solidifying. "And we save the HFY." Lyra smiled, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "Let's do it." They had found the key. Now it was time to act before it was too late. Kane stood by the workstation, his mind focused on the data in front of him. It had taken hours to isolate the part of his immune system that was working to fight off the virus. The results were promising, but there was still so much to do. Time was running out, and the HFY were still suffering. Lyra had left to gather the final medical supplies they needed, leaving Kane alone in the lab. He glanced at the clock on the wall. The outbreak had been spreading for days, and every moment they wasted was another moment the virus had to claim more lives. Taileyes was gone, but the rest of the HFY people were depending on them now. Kane had worked with viruses before, but this was different. This virus was smart, evolving at a rapid pace, adapting to whatever defenses they tried. But now, with the information they had gathered, they were finally starting to see a path forward. He adjusted the settings on the microscope, staring intently at the sample. The virus was still there, moving, shifting, as it had always done. But now it seemed slower, almost as if it were trying to understand its environment. It was still adapting, but it wasn't changing as quickly as before. Maybe, just maybe, they had found the key to stopping it. Kane's heart raced. The virus was still unpredictable, but now he had something to fight back with. He wasn't sure how much longer his immunity would hold, but if they could replicate it, the HFY would have a chance. Lyra entered the room, her arms full of medical supplies. She placed the items down on the counter and walked over to Kane. "We're ready," she said, her voice steady but tired. The exhaustion in her eyes was clear, but she had not once hesitated in helping him. Kane nodded and turned to face her. "We've isolated the part of my immune system that's reacting to the virus. If we can replicate this, we can create a treatment." Lyra's eyes lit up. "How do we make it work?" "We need to synthesize it into a serum," Kane replied. "That's the next step. It's not going to be easy. We'll need to introduce it into the bodies of the infected and see how it reacts." Lyra nodded, though a hint of fear flickered across her face. "And if it doesn't work," Kane's expression hardened, "then we keep trying. We don't have another choice." They worked together, gathering the necessary materials and preparing the serum. Kane couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. It was no longer just about saving one life. It was about saving an entire species. The HFY were a proud race, but they were vulnerable in this moment, and if he failed, he couldn't bear the thought of what would happen to them. Lyra worked quickly, her hands moving with practiced precision. Kane watched her, amazed at her strength. In the midst of all this chaos, she had kept her focus. She had kept going, even when it seemed like there was no hope. It took hours to synthesize the serum. The lab was filled with the soft hum of machines and the occasional beeping of equipment. Kane and Lyra hardly spoke during the process, each of them focused on their task. But there was a quiet understanding between them. They both knew how important this was. They both knew that if they failed, there might not be another chance. Once the serum was ready, Kane carefully loaded it into the injection device. "This is it," he said quietly. "Now we see if it works." Lyra stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the device. "What if it does?" Kane took a deep breath. "Then we try again. And again if we have to." Lyra nodded, her face set with determination. "Let's do this." Kane walked to the quarantine area where the remaining Ithari who were still alive were being kept. The medical staff had done what they could, but the situation was growing more desperate by the hour. As Kane entered the room, several of the Ithari doctors looked up at him. They had been working non-stop, trying to find a solution, but it had been in vain. They were out of options. Kane didn't have the time for pleasantries. He walked straight to the bed where a young Ithari man lay, struggling to breathe. His skin was pale and his chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. The virus had already taken a heavy toll on him. "This is the one," Kane said to Lyra, who had followed him into the room. She nodded and stepped forward. "Are you sure about this?" Kane glanced at her, his expression serious. "If we don't try, we'll never know. The serum might be the only chance he has left." Lyra hesitated for a moment before nodding. She gently placed her hand on the Ithari man's arm. "I trust you, Dr. Kane." Kane carefully administered the serum, watching closely for any signs of a reaction. For several long moments there was nothing. The room was still, the only sound the quiet beeping of the medical monitors. Then, slowly, the Ithari man's breathing began to steady. His chest rose and fell with more ease, and his skin started to regain some color. Kane felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was working. It was actually working. Lyra let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Is he?" Kane smiled for the first time in days. "He's stabilizing." They watched as the young Ithari man's condition improved. The virus hadn't been eradicated yet, but the serum had given him a fighting chance. Kane knew they couldn't stop now. This was just the beginning. Over the next several hours, they continued to administer the serum to more infected Ithari. Each time, the results were the same: improvement, stabilization, and hope. Kane's heart lifted with each success, but he knew it wasn't over yet. They had to make sure the treatment would work on everyone, not just a few. As the night wore on, Lyra and Kane moved from bed to bed, treating the sick and offering them the serum. The mood in the room began to shift. What had once been filled with despair was now filled with cautious optimism. By the time dawn broke, the first signs of recovery were visible in nearly all the patients. They were breathing more easily, their color returning. Some were even sitting up, asking for water. It was a miracle, but Kane knew that they still had a long way to go. The virus was still there, and it was still mutating. They couldn't afford to relax, not yet. Lyra stood beside him, watching the patients as they recovered. "You did it, Dr. Kane, you really did it." Kane shook his head. "We did it. We couldn't have done it without you." Lyra smiled, her eyes bright with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you." Kane turned to face her, his expression softening. "We still have work to do, but we've made it this far, and that's something worth fighting for." Together, they continued to treat the infected, knowing that the path ahead would still be difficult. But for the first time since the outbreak, there was a sense of hope in the air. They had found a way to fight back, and as long as they kept going, they knew they had a chance to save the Ithari. The air was thick with the hum of machines and the quiet rustle of medical staff moving through the room. Kane sat at the table, his eyes scanning the data from the latest tests. The serum had worked. It had stabilized the infected Ithari, giving them a chance at recovery. But as he looked at the monitors, he knew it wasn't over yet. The virus was still there, still changing. They had to make sure they could stop it before it could adapt again. Lyra stood beside him, watching the patients who had been treated. Some were sitting up, drinking water. Others were still weak, but their breathing was steady, their hearts beating strong. There was a new sense of hope in the room. The atmosphere that had once been filled with dread now held the quiet excitement of survival. "How many have recovered so far?" Lyra asked, her voice soft but filled with awe. Kane glanced at the numbers. "About 70%. We've still got more to treat, but the serum is holding up. The rest should follow." Lyra smiled, though it was tinged with exhaustion. She hadn't slept in days, but she had kept going, kept fighting. Kane knew that without her, they wouldn't have made it this far. "We can't stop yet," Kane said, his voice steady. "The virus is still out there. We have to keep testing, keep refining the serum. We need to be sure it works for everyone." Lyra nodded. "I understand, but for now, we've made a difference. We've given them a chance." They moved through the room, checking on the patients, offering them water, ensuring they were comfortable. The atmosphere was different now, less tense, less fearful. The Ithari were starting to regain some of their strength, their spirits lifting as they realized they had a chance at survival. Kane and Lyra continued working, adjusting the serum's formula where necessary, making sure the treatment was as effective as possible. Each day brought new successes, new improvements. The virus was weakening, its grip loosening. But Kane knew they couldn't afford to relax, not when there were still so many unknowns. As the days passed, the Ithari who had been treated grew stronger. Kane and Lyra worked tirelessly, but their efforts were beginning to pay off. The outbreak, which had seemed like an unstoppable force, was slowly coming under control. The city that had once been on the brink of collapse was now beginning to recover. There were still many who had not yet been treated, but Kane had faith. They had found the solution. The virus could be stopped. One evening, as Kane was reviewing more data, Lyra entered the room, her face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "We've done it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Kane looked up, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" "The last batch of patients. They're all improving. The serum is working on everyone now. The virus isn't adapting anymore. We've stopped it." Kane stood up, his heart beating faster. He felt the weight of her words sink in. "You're sure?" Lyra nodded, her eyes shining with tears. "They're all recovering. We did it, Dr. Kane. We saved them." Kane took a deep breath, his chest swelling with pride. It had been a long, hard fight, but they had done it. They had saved the Ithari from the brink of extinction. But the relief was tempered by the knowledge that they could not have succeeded without the help of the others, the medical staff, the leaders, and most importantly, Lyra. Lyra stepped closer, her hand brushing against Kane's arm. "We've made a real difference, haven't we?" Kane smiled, though it was tinged with weariness. "Yes, we've saved lives. We've given them a future." They stood together in the quiet of the lab, looking out at the people they had saved. The virus that had threatened to destroy an entire species had been stopped, and the Ithari were beginning to recover. The journey had been long and difficult, but they had made it through. "Thank you, Dr. Kane," Lyra said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. "You saved us. You saved my people." Kane looked at her, his eyes filled with understanding. "We saved them together." As the days passed, the recovery continued. The Ithari were returning to their daily lives, though the shadow of the virus still lingered. But there was no doubt now. Thanks to Kane's immunity and Lyra's determination, the Ithari had a chance to rebuild, to move forward. And with their help, the galaxy would never forget the humans who had stood by their side. Weeks later, after the virus had been fully eradicated, Kane found himself standing at the front of the Ithari Council Hall, Lyra beside him. The room was filled with the leaders of their people, their faces solemn but filled with gratitude. The Ithari had lost much, but they were rebuilding, and they owed it all to the humans who had come to their aid. The Ithari elder, a tall figure with deep blue skin and silver eyes, stood before him. "Dr. Kane," the elder said, his voice booming through the hall. "We owe you our survival. Without your knowledge, your resilience, we would have perished." Kane shook his head. "I didn't do it alone. Lyra, the medical teams, everyone played a part. This was a victory for all of us." The elder nodded, his eyes turning to Lyra. "We will never forget your courage, your determination. You saved us all." Lyra bowed her head, but her eyes glistened with emotion. "It was the least I could do," she said softly. Kane and Lyra stood together, side by side, knowing that their efforts had made a difference. The Ithari would never forget what they had done, and the bond between their two peoples would be forever strengthened. As the ceremony came to an end, the elder stepped forward again. "As a token of our gratitude, we offer you a gift, our people's deepest respect and alliance. We stand with you as you have stood with us." Kane nodded, accepting the honor. But it wasn't the gift that mattered most. What mattered was the future they had helped create, the future of the Ithari and the future of humanity. Together, they had overcome a threat that could have destroyed both their worlds. And in doing so, they had forged a lasting bond, a bond that would continue to grow, no matter the distance between their people. As the ceremony ended and the Ithari leaders filed out of the room, Lyra turned to Kane, a smile playing at the corners of her lips. "You did it, Dr. Kane," she said, her voice light with relief. Kane smiled back. "We did it, Lyra, together." And with that, they left the hall, stepping into the new dawn of a world forever changed. The Ithari were safe, their future secure, and the bond between humans and aliens had never been stronger.